All right, welcome back, everybody, to the brain injury discussion. This is Jay. We're going to talk about a little bit of the basic anatomy of the brain. Of course, we'd love a thumbs up. We would also like a comment. Maybe there's something interesting that you learned. And of course, there's always more to learn. And there will be more videos about anatomy in the future. And why should we know about anatomy? Is the brain just one part? Well, just like a car engine, there's multiple parts of the brain. So, using location, we can understand how and why things happen the way they do, especially with a brain injury, and also what happens post brain injury. What happens if there's a deficit in one of those areas? So again, and we're also going to look at, how the brain naturally protects itself. And of course, we've talked about protecting our brains. It's a very valuable thing. We should protect it. And maybe that would be a good idea for us to think about. So again, this is just a very general overview, but I hope you're able to take something away from this. So today we're going to talk about the four lobes of the brain as well as the basic brain protection, so the skull. But we're mainly going to be focusing on the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Of course, there are way more brain structures than just the four lobes. You got the cerebellum over here. You got the spinal cord, midbrain, and medulla oblongata. There's a lot more in there, but this is just meant to be a very basic overview of the four main lobes, and we're going to talk about those because they're important to talk about. Why not? So the frontal lobe, which is this area from the um, they call it the motor cortex all the way around, and it stops here at the temporal lobe over here. So this is all the frontal lobe. And again, the frontal lobe contains a lot of different things, and we're looking at a lot of motor functions. Of course, in this area right here, that's what they call the motor cortex, MC, if you wanted to call it that. And again, that pertains to the motion or the movement of different parts of the body. But the frontal lobe contains a lot of executive functioning, so the ability to interpret, to make expression, the different areas of art, logic, all of that comes from the frontal lobe of the brain. And it also talks about voluntary movement. So if you're watching this video, you made a voluntary movement to click on this video, and I'd hope you make a voluntary movement to give us a thumbs up and a subscribe. But this also, this is the lobe that talks about emotions and thinking. So this is that very detailed technical aspect to it. So that's what I find very interesting. And of course, there's a lot more and there's a lot of specific areas there, but that'll be for a later video. The parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is this area right here that starts with the sensory cortex, which is right about here, and it encompasses all the way down until you hit the occipital lobe. And what does the parietal lobe do? Well, it deals a lot with sensation, a lot of perception, a lot of sensation, how the brain intakes information. So, how does the brain intake information? The sensory cortex intakes it by a few different ways. And again, if you're hearing me, that's your parietal lobe. If you had morning coffee this morning, like I did, you tasted it. So, that's the parietal lobe. If you're watching this video and you're looking at me, you're obviously using your parietal lobe and other parts of the brain about sight. And of course, if you touched your phone or your computer to log in on this, you used your parietal lobe because it's receiving information. Again, this is also known as the sensory cortex. So there's different areas of the brain, and of course, those are some of the areas that are mapped out. So with that being said, that's the parietal lobe in a nutshell. The temporal lobe. Obviously, this is the area that's close to the ears, and this pertains to a few areas with the ears. We're going to talk a little bit about, hey, this is the language area, which again, when we talk about speech, we're talking about Wernicke's area, which is right about, yeah, right about there in the temporal lobe. So again, the temporal lobe's close to the ears. It does play a part in memory. It does play a big part in hearing, but also Wernicke's area, right There. Now, again, you can imagine if someone had a brain injury there, their understanding of speech, maybe their hearing might be affected. So, those are kind of the things that we think about as brain injury case managers is what kind of injuries have they had and where it is located on the brain. So, that being said, that's the temporal lobe in a nutshell. The occipital lobe. The occipital lobe starts here at the end of the parietal lobe and goes down into the bottom parts of the brain. Of course, it borders the cerebellum, and of course, it touches also the temporal lobe. So the occipital lobe, of course, if you know any Latin, you'll recognize that, pertains to the eyes. So the eyes are right about here, and they go through the brain and they actually connect back here. So again, if you're thinking in terms of brain injury, if someone's got affected vision, they were probably hit in the back of the head. So a blow to the back of the head might include problems with the front of the head, which is the eyes. But it does a lot with the visual processing information. So it's going to interpret the color. For example, it's going to tell you whether that stoplight is, red, green, or even yellow. Um, it's going to talk about the shape. So obviously a stop sign is a shape. It's what's going to determine, hey, what does this sign mean? Also talks about positioning. So positioning of an object. Well, maybe that stop sign is 100 yards away. So maybe I should start slowing down at about 50 yards or however long, depending on your speed. So obviously, this is a big role to play in our daily lives, just like the rest of the lobes. So the occipital lobe does a lot with the eyes. And, if you were to ask someone, would you rather go blind or would you rather go deaf? I'm pretty sure most people would say deaf because your eyes are very important, even in day-to-day functioning. So that is the occipital lobe in a nutshell. And so, what have we been talking about? We've been talking about locations of things in the brain, right? In the textbook that I've been using to make this thing, the Essential Brain Injury Guide, they tell a story about a railroad worker who was the first real modern documented brain injury to survive. He had a piece of a railroad tool go into his frontal lobe. So again, it went in here. It came out here because he was working around dynamite. Dynamite does not sound like a very safe thing, but he came out different. Like they noted that his personality was different. And so if we look here on this brain map of again, like this is not everything pertaining to the brain, but this is a lot of the areas have been mapped out into certain aspects of the brain. And of course, neuroplasticity plays a role in changing that. But he came out different. He was prior to that brain injury, he was no, he was what they called normal. But afterwards, he had lost a lot of his inhibition, his intuition, his also like mindset. His mind kind of reverted back because it lost a lot of memory. It took a lot of damage. So, if we look at the areas that he was hurt, we're talking maybe he wasn't really hitting the motor cortex nor the sensory cortex. So he could walk, he could eat, but he was hitting the frontal lobe. So again, that's we're thinking executive function and thinking about what not to say, imagination, impulsive, maybe there's some interpretation there that just didn't go well after that injury. Of course, injured brain, that kind of makes sense. Someone who's been hit in the back of the head, obviously the way to perceive and to see things would have been affected. And the same thing goes for someone who's been hit on the top of the head, like let's say the area right here around the legs and the feet. Obviously, they're probably going to walk a little bit differently because that sensory area, or even like, let's say, the motor area, that would change the brain's way of interpreting that information. Um, so it would change how the person walks. So, with that being said, there's a lot more that still needs to be learned about the brain, but there's a lot that has already been done. So, how does this really apply to the brain injury world? Well, if we're able to map this out, if we're able to find the pinpoints of these different injuries, maybe that would allow us to make better decisions, especially if you are a neurologist, a neurosurgeon, or case manager, or if you are in the clinical realm. Being able to know what should be there helps you make a better decision. Obviously, we're talking in the world of ideals and what ifs, but that story I talked about the railroad worker who had a frontal lobe injury, he came out different. His personality was different. And there was a lot that was different. Prior to that, he was normal, but then you see that something was off afterwards. And so those are the kind of things that helped us do brain mapping, where we're starting to understand the location and how it correlates to the rest of the body. And like we've talked about in other videos, this isn't necessarily just about the brain as one organ. It's a collection of different parts to make an organ, just like a car engine is just a car is not just the engine. It's the drive shaft, it's the body, it's the windshield, etc. There's more that goes into it than just one part. So, and again, this mapping allows for better diagnosis, better treatment, and of course, the understanding of what's going on. So again, that frontal lobe injured railroad worker is probably not thinking quite as clearly as they did before that brain injury. Um, and so this is where it all kind of correlates, right? When we do our brain mapping, when we find out what was actually injured, um, you start being able to use that information to make better decisions, especially if you're in a clinical world. And so, with that being said, we also need to talk a little bit about the protection of the brain. So, we talk a lot about brain injuries, but there's a lot of things that are naturally in place to protect, and this is usually called the meninges, which, if you've ever heard the term meningitis, that usually correlates to the swelling and the compression or the pressure on the brain. And so up here, we got the scalp, which again, that's the soft layer of skin. Skin, has hair most of the time, um, has hair. It helps insulate, but it's also a soft layer of protection. So we got the skin, then we got the skull, which is the cranium, right? That's that hard layer of protection for your brain. And then, of course, the brain is a very soft, mushy organ that is inside of a very hard skull with bony ridges. So the brain is that hard protection. It's kind of natural that it helps protect the brain from natural stuff, right? And in between the skull and the brain, you also have dura mater, which is dura mater is Latin for tough mother. So it's a tough layer of protection. It's more of a skin-like substance. You have your anacroid, which is kind of in between. And then you have what's called your pia mater, which is, soft mother. It's that area that helps add a little bit of extra cushioning, protection. And again, compared to it's not just that there's jello inside of a hard substance equation. This is more protection than just that. You also have, and each one of these protections, so obviously the scalp is protecting against outside, the skull will be protecting against anything that pierces that. The dura mater is there to help prevent the brain from pushing against the skull. And of course, all these things play into effect to keep a nice level playing field. So there's a certain pressure that has to be maintained to, um, and of course, there are potential for brain injuries. I mean, the further deeper you go, the more potential for brain injury. But knowing that it's not just the skull, we're also dealing with a couple more layers in between the skull and the brain that helps add cushioning to that brain. So again, this is all good information to know. And, every time, obviously, football or whatever sports you'll watch, you'll see that they're wearing helmet. It's like putting another cranium on top of your skull. So, and that's just things to think about. It's like, okay, well, the brain injury world can be kind of big. So, obviously, knowing the brain and mapping it helps us understand the brain, helps us understand brain injuries, and especially people with brain injuries. And of course, knowing the broad areas, it's like, okay, I got hit in the front of my head. Well, that helps us make better decisions about, what's going on. And the same thing goes with the mapping, and it makes us draw better conclusions. More information, usually the better. So again, sources will be in the description below. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day.